Hey, what's up, metal and heavy music fans? It's Flight of Icarus again with MetalTrenches.com, and today I've got 6 progressive metal albums for those just getting started in the genre. And hey, if you like to be kept up to date with the best and brightest metal bands and albums from the underground and above, then stick with me by hitting that subscribe button down below. Alright, we're going to kick this off with a really obvious choice here, but I think it's an important one, and that is Tool with Lateralus. Pretty sure this was my very first progressive metal album. In fact, I didn't actually like Tool when I first heard them. I was more of a Perfect Circle fan for a while, but over time it just started to sink its hooks into me, and I'll never forget the first time I saw the music video for Schism. Walked into like a party at a friend's house and it just came up for the first time and we were all just dead silent watching that thing. And for good reason. Like, there's a lot of amazing things about this album, and honestly, like, even though they kind of get trashed as sort of being like prog metal light, which, you know, in comparison to some other more proggy groups, so to speak, out there, I can understand that, but there is a reason why Tool got so big with this sound and why we should commend them for it, because this is a band of very talented musicians and they managed to kind of elevate this sound into the mainstream, which is somewhere that it hasn't always been able to break through before. You got Danny Carey, who honestly is just an amazing drummer. You got Maynard's just trademark vocals. Nobody else truly sounds like him. You've got Adam Jones on the guitar, and while he may not be the most technical guitar player out there, there's something about his style of riffing that is just so unique to him and so important to the band's sound. And same with Justin Chancellor. You've got some amazing bass grooves all over this album. Of course, again, going back to Schism, like, that riff will remain in infamy. Very consistent record with a lot of amazing songs. You got The Grudge, you've got The Patient, you've got Parabola, you've got Lateralus. I love the songwriting. If you want to hear me talk even more in depth about this album, I've got a Tool tier list where I talk through every single album. Personally, I'm actually more of a Anima, however you want to pronounce it, fan overall by just a hair, but in terms of kind of the album that I think is a good starter album, this is a better place to start because it's not as kind of experimental and weird as that one gets. Alright, next up, probably another obvious one that everyone's going to have on their list. We've got Opeth with Blackwater Park. There's a lot of different Opeth albums you could pick for this list, but Blackwater Park is arguably kind of the most accessible and, again, probably the most consistent, I would say. I also have a tier list for Opeth. You can check out my thoughts on all their albums, but over the years, this has still been my favorite, and another one too that kind of broke through the sound barrier and became a mainstream success despite being a very aggressive and kind of like meaty album. There's a lot of dynamics here, a lot of up and downs with the acoustic sections and then the very abrasive death metal vocals. I love the guitar riffs. This album has some of the most like legendary Ackerfeld riffs on it. When you think of how he plays the guitar, like you can't help but think of that bouncy like like I immediately think of that riff anytime I want to describe what does Opeth sound like. Amazing tracks on here. The Leper Affinity is one of the best album openers probably of all time. Bleak, The Funeral Portrait. Ackerfeld's vocals are also incredible all over this album, just from the, again, really intense, ominous, just surround you and crush you death metal vocals to his more ethereal, clean singing. Just an all-around masterpiece if you ask me, and a perfect, again, starter album for people who are just starting to get into more aggressive progressive metal, and progressive death metal in particular. Alright, next up we've got Mastodon with Crack the Skye. Just put out my tier list for Mastodon as well, so you can hear about all of my thoughts on all of the Mastodon albums. I have a lot of favorites from this band, and a lot of albums, again, that we probably could pick, but for me, Crack the Skye is their like crowning achievement. The songwriting is incredible. You got a lot of like longer songs. They all kind of flow together. They've done a lot of concept albums, but this is the one I feel like most seamlessly from song to song just like builds and builds and builds to this amazing conclusion. And despite some of the songs being on the longer side, they're still quite accessible thanks to some very catchy vocals and some hooky guitars. My personal favorite tracks on this one, Oblivion, Divinations, love the acoustic on that one, Crack the Skye, and the conclusion, The Last Baron, which is just epic in every sense of the word. Mastodon, another obviously very talented band, and another one that's managed to kind of tread the line and bring prog elements into the mainstream. They've done more aggressive progressive metal albums, but then they've also kind of ventured into more kind of progressive rock territory too on Once More Around the Sun, which is probably another good entry-level album. But this, personally, if you want to get into Mastodon and you want to get into just sort of the pantheon of progressive metal and really expand your horizons, then for me, Crack the Skye is the album to go with. But hey, let's say like with me, your gateway into metal was more from kind of a metalcore route, and so another early progressive metal album that got me into this genre was Between the Buried and Me with Colors. Again, every album this band has put out is pretty much fantastic, but this is sort of the piece de resistance. Like, this is the album everybody talks about. They have kind of more technical albums than this. I almost went with Parallax, which would be another great choice, but I feel like Colors is a little bit more accessible, and then of course a lot of people are going to recognize Prequel to the Sequel, which was featured on Rock Band and was very fun to play on that game. And speaking of which, again, some very just amazing riffage all over this album. Just lots of fun guitar parts that get stuck in your head in the same way that other songs will get catchy lyrics stuck in your head. And another album too, where each song builds and builds on the last one. You've got some seamless transitions that kind of connect them and make this whole just epic concept kind of come to fruition on White Walls, which is an amazing conclusion. Other great tracks on here, The Decade of Statues, Informal Gluttony, but really every single song has something to offer, and the songwriting is just fantastic. And again, kind of good job straddling the line between what metalcore fans look for in metalcore, but taking it into another territory with this more progressive songwriting. All right, another band that we could not end this list without discussing, it's Gojira with From Mars to Sirius. Gojira was a band I actually got into pretty late, but as soon as I heard them, I had to binge every single album and ended up picking up most of them, and now they are all sitting on my shelf. And guess what? Do I have an album tier list for Gojira? Yes, I do. You should check that out too to hear even more in-depth thoughts about each of their albums. But From Mars to Sirius, again, sort of like what I've been saying with all these bands, this is sort of my favorite album from them, and it's their first kind of true Gojira album, if you ask me. I know they have 2 other albums before this, but I think this is where they really honed their sound and truly became what we know them as today in terms of their songwriting, their vocals, their guitars. This is another band, too, that has sort of like a trademark to their guitar sound, and the more I'm thinking about it, actually, as I'm just talking through these, I've never thought about it before, but pretty much every band on this list kind of has that in common. And maybe that's just because I'm kind of a guitar guy, and that's what attracted me to them in the first place, but I also think that has something to do with why these bands have become so big, despite being progressive metal bands that otherwise might not have been noticed. But yeah, with Gojira, there's that classic Gojira slide with the harmonic that we all kind of associate with their sound, and there's plenty of that on this album, but a lot more too. Very expansive tracks, very just sort of meditative album too, and so it gets very heavy, but also just really puts you like in this headspace where you're very introspective. In a way, I kind of compare my mentality listening to this album to the same place that I go when I listen to Tool's albums, even though they're very different in their sound and overall approach. But yeah, this is an album where we're really starting to get into the meat of it, and I feel like by the time you're kind of ready, so to speak, to enjoy Gojira and these types of albums, then you're going to be ready to branch out into all sorts of interesting and maybe more expansive directions. All right, and then last but not least, I know I normally do 5 albums on this list, but I narrowed it down to these 6, and when it came down to it, I just didn't have it in me to take any single one of them off. It seemed like they were all kind of equally important to me and what I was trying to portray here. And so, without burying the lead, we've got Enslaved with Issa. And I saved this one for last because this is definitely the most probably challenging album on this list in terms of its extremity, because we've still got their classic black metal roots coming through on this one, some very harsh vocals. The production is still kind of a little raw, but this is also where they're implementing more kind of like Hammond organ, more keyboards, more of those kind of like 70s prog arrangements. They have plenty of other albums, especially now they've moved even more in that direction, and then even before this there are albums where they started to kind of toy with this, but for me this is sort of like the apex album that's probably a good entry-level one. I know it was for me. The songwriting on here is spectacular, and again, even though it's harsh and raw and aggressive and kind of cold in that second wave black metal way, there's this certain like emotion to it. There's this certain feeling to it that really sucks you in and envelopes you. And so again, I feel like if you can work up to this album and learn to enjoy it, first of all, get into all of Enslaved's discography because all of their albums are fantastic. But second of all, this is going to be sort of the make or break moment where you can kind of, if you can enjoy this album, I feel like you can kind of enjoy anything within the prog metal pantheon at this point. Couple tracks to check out: the title track, Lunar Force, Violet Dawning, Neogenesis. But yeah, listen to this album and enjoy it. And that's it, y'all. Those are the 6 albums I really wanted to feature for beginners in the progressive metal genre. I know there's plenty of others I could have put on here, some of which are just because I'm not as big a fan of them personally. Like Dream Theater seems like an obvious choice. I'll definitely throw them out here as an honorable mention because obviously a lot of people love Dream Theater, and they're pretty accessible if you like that kind of sound. Personally, I'm not really into that style of singing, so that's why I didn't go in depth with them. But yeah, let me know down in the comments which of these albums are your favorites, and also who would you have included on this list. And hey, stick around because I got plenty more videos coming right after this one. I have a few more of these Metal for Dummies videos you can check out, but also tier lists, interviews with bands on the podcast, full album reviews from more recent albums. You name it, we've got it, so plenty of reasons to subscribe again if you have not already. In the description, you can find links to our social media where you can follow us, the email newsletter I send out personally every Friday, metaltrenches.com for even more reviews and content, and our Patreon and Subscribe Star. If you want to take that extra jump to becoming a full-on supporter, even just $1 a month gets you early access to content and helps me keep this train a-rolling. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.